The date was October 16, 1941, and Moscow was burning. German artillery shells were landing in the city's outer districts. Panzer divisions were less than 80 kilometers away. Stalin had already evacuated most government officials to Kuibyshev, over 800 kilometers to the east. Smoke from burning documents darkened the sky as ministries destroyed anything that might be useful to the advancing Wehrmacht. But in the Kirov machine-building plant on Moscow's southern edge, something extraordinary was happening. Workers weren't fleeing. They were dismantling. Massive lathes that weighed 40 tons each were being unbolted from concrete foundations. Overhead cranes were being taken apart piece by piece. Electric motors, conveyor belts, testing equipment, even the light fixtures. Everything was being cataloged, crated, and loaded onto waiting freight trains. Within 72 hours, the entire factory would cease to exist in Moscow. Within 6 weeks, it would be producing tanks again, 2,000 kilometers away in the Ural Mountains. This wasn't an isolated incident. Between June and December 1941, the Soviet Union executed the largest industrial relocation in human history. Over 1,500 major factories, 2.5 million railway cars of equipment, and approximately 10 million workers and their families were moved from the Western Soviet Union to the east. Ahead of the Nazi invasion, the operation was so massive, so audacious, and so successful that it literally changed the outcome of World War II. This is the story of how a nation picked itself up and moved, one factory at a time. The impossible math to understand the scale of what the Soviets attempted, you need to grasp the mathematics of industrial evacuation. It's not like moving house. When you relocate a factory, you're not just moving machines. You're moving an entire ecosystem. A typical Soviet heavy industry plant in 1941 contained 500 to 2,000 machine tools, each weighing between 5 and 100 tons foundry equipment, including blast furnaces that were 20 meters tall, miles of electrical wiring, and plumbing technical documentation, blueprints, and specialized tools, raw materials, and partially finished products, the workers who knew how to operate everything. The Kirov plant alone required 200 railway freight cars just for its heavy equipment. The Zaporozhye steel plant needed 8,000 railway cars. The total across all evacuated facilities came to roughly 1.5 million freight cars worth of industrial equipment. Here's the problem. The Soviet railway system in 1941 had approximately 800,000 freight cars in total, and most of those were already being used to move troops, ammunition, and supplies to the front lines. The railways were also being targeted by German bombers, with tracks damaged daily and locomotives destroyed weekly. The man tasked with solving this impossible logistics puzzle was Alexei Kosygin, then a 37-year-old bureaucrat in the State Defense Committee. Kosygin wasn't a general or an engineer. He was an economist who understood supply chains, and he was about to coordinate the largest industrial migration ever attempted. The Evacuation Council on June 24, 1941, just 2 days after the German invasion began, Stalin convened an emergency meeting of the State Defense Committee. The news was catastrophic. German forces were advancing at speeds that seemed impossible. Entire Soviet armies were being surrounded and destroyed. Major cities were falling within days. Stalin's question was direct. Can we move our factories? The initial response from his military advisors was skeptical. Moving a factory takes months, even years. It requires careful planning, proper infrastructure at the destination, and most importantly, time. They had none of those things. But Kosygin saw it differently. He had been studying Soviet railway capacity and industrial distribution for years. He knew something the generals didn't. The Soviet Union had been building industrial centers in the Urals and Siberia throughout the 1930s as part of Stalin's five-year plans. These cities, Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk, Magnitogorsk, had power stations, railway connections, and housing. They weren't finished, but they existed. What they lacked was modern machinery. Kosygin proposed something that sounded insane: evacuate the machinery from the west and marry it to the infrastructure in the east. Strip the western factories to their bare foundations and rebuild them beyond the Urals where German tanks couldn't reach them. The Council for Evacuation was formed on June 27th, just 5 days after the invasion. Kosygin was appointed deputy chairman. They were given absolute authority to commandeer any transport, requisition any resources, and override any local officials who got in the way. They had, optimistically, perhaps 4 months before major industrial centers would fall to the Germans. In reality, they would have far less. The human conveyor belt. The evacuation didn't happen in neat, organized phases. It was chaos, executed at railway speed. Priority 1 facilities, those producing weapons and ammunition, went first. The Stalin automobile factory in Moscow began dismantling in early July. Workers operated in shifts around the clock. The day shift operated the machines, producing as many vehicles as possible. The night shift dismantled those same machines and loaded them onto trains. Marina Raskova, a 28-year-old metallurgist from Leningrad, kept a diary during the evacuation that provides a glimpse into what this actually looked like on the ground. July 18, 1941. We received orders today. The entire rolling mill is to be evacuated within 3 days. 3 days. The furnaces alone will take a day to cool. Management says we must work without stopping. They've brought in additional railway cars, but there aren't enough. We're loading equipment onto flatbed cars meant for timber. No one knows where we're going. They say east. That's all. July 20th. We loaded the last lathe onto the train this morning. Some of the women were crying. This factory has been here since 1897. My grandfather worked here. Now it's just empty buildings. We leave tomorrow. Each worker is allowed 1 suitcase. I'm bringing my tools and my daughter's photograph. Everything else stays. The personal cost of the evacuation was staggering. Workers were essentially told, you can come with the factory or you can stay and face the Germans. Most chose to come. Families were split apart. Children were sent to relatives in other cities or, in many cases, brought along on the factory trains despite the danger. The trains themselves became mobile communities. A typical evacuation train carried not just machinery, but 1,000 to 2,000 workers and their families, along with whatever food, water, and supplies could be scrounged. The journey east could take anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months, depending on railway conditions and German bombing. People slept on top of crated machinery. They ate whatever food was distributed at railway stations along the route. Children played between enormous lathes strapped to flatbed cars. Women gave birth in boxcars. People died from illness, cold, and occasionally from German air attacks that targeted the railway lines. The Urals crucible. The destination for most evacuated factories was the Ural Mountains region, a harsh landscape of forests, low mountains, and bitter winters where temperatures regularly dropped to -40°C. Cities like Chelyabinsk, which had a pre-war population of 273,000, suddenly received 200,000 evacuees and hundreds of factories in the span of 3 months. There wasn't housing for them. There wasn't food for them. There weren't even buildings to put the factories in. They built them anyway. The standard procedure was this: the factory equipment would arrive by train. Workers would immediately begin unloading it, even before any buildings were constructed. The machinery was placed on the ground, covered with tarps, and work began immediately, in open air in the middle of the Ural winter. Simultaneously, construction brigades would begin erecting factory buildings around the working machinery. Workers operated lathes in -30-degree weather while construction crews built walls around them. There are photographs from late 1941 showing workers machining tank parts while snow falls on their heads, with factory walls rising in the background. The Kirov plant, which had been evacuated from Leningrad, was producing tank components within 11 days of its equipment arriving in Chelyabinsk. The factory building itself wasn't completed for another 6 weeks, but production couldn't wait. Every day without production was another day the Wehrmacht advanced. The human cost was severe. Workers labored in shifts of 12 to 16 hours. Food was rationed to minimal levels. Housing was whatever could be constructed quickly: barracks, dugouts, even tents. The winter of 1941-42 in the Urals was particularly brutal, and thousands of evacuees died from cold, malnutrition, and disease. But they kept producing. By December 1941, evacuated factories were outputting 40% of their pre-evacuation production levels. By March 1942, they had reached 80%. By June 1942, many evacuated plants were exceeding their original production capacity. The technical miracle, what makes the Soviet evacuation even more remarkable, is that it wasn't just a matter of moving machines from point A to point B. The Soviets were simultaneously upgrading and reorganizing their entire industrial structure. Kozygin's team made a crucial decision early on. They wouldn't simply recreate the Western factories in the East. Instead, they would consolidate and specialize. Multiple small plants producing similar products would be combined into single, larger facilities. Modern production techniques would be implemented. Bottlenecks would be eliminated. The result was that evacuated factories often became more efficient than the originals had been. Take the tank production complex that emerged around Chelyabinsk. Before the war, Soviet tanks were produced at multiple facilities across the western USSR: engines at one plant, transmissions at another, armor plating at a third, with final assembly at yet another location. This required extensive transportation of components and resulted in frequent supply chain disruptions. In Chelyabinsk, evacuated machinery from 4 different plants was combined into what became known as Tankograd, Tank City. The Kirov plant brought its engine manufacturing capability. The Kharkov diesel factory brought transmission expertise. The Mariupol metallurgical plant contributed armor plate production. The assembly facilities came from multiple sources. The result was an integrated production facility that could manufacture a complete T-34 tank from raw steel to finished product in a single location. By 1943, Tankograd alone was producing more tanks per month than all of Germany's tank factories combined. This wasn't planned in advance. It emerged organically from the evacuation process, as engineers and managers realized they had an opportunity to rebuild Soviet industry more efficiently than it had existed before. The railway war. None of this would have been possible without the Soviet railway system, which performed feats of logistics that still seem improbable today. The Evacuation Council operated on a priority system. Trains carrying factory equipment had second priority, right behind trains carrying military supplies to the front. This meant that civilian passenger traffic essentially stopped. Food distribution was disrupted. Normal economic activity ground to a halt. The railway workers themselves were performing under impossible conditions. German bombers specifically targeted railway infrastructure, destroying tracks, bridges, and locomotives. Repair crews worked continuously, often under fire. In some cases, Tracks were destroyed and rebuilt multiple times as front lines shifted. The Soviet solution was characteristically brutal and effective: redundancy and improvisation. When the main line was destroyed, trains were rerouted hundreds of kilometers through secondary routes. When bridges were destroyed, temporary wooden bridges were constructed in hours. When locomotives were destroyed, older, less efficient engines were pressed into service. The Trans-Siberian Railway, which ran from Moscow to Vladivostok, became the lifeline of Soviet industry. At the peak of the evacuation in October and November 1941, a train departed Moscow for the east every 6 minutes. The system was operating at 300% of its designed capacity. Accidents were common: overloaded trains derailed, tired engineers fell asleep at the controls, bridges collapsed under excessive weight. But the trains kept moving because the alternative was losing the war. The cost of survival. By December 1941, the immediate evacuation phase was complete. Over 1,500 major enterprises had been relocated. The numbers are staggering. 1,523 industrial facilities, evacuated 2,593,000 railway cars of equipment, transported 10 to 12 million people, relocated 136 ammunition plants, moved 94 metallurgical plants, moved 46 tractor and automobile plants, moved. But these numbers don't capture the human cost. Tens of thousands of people died during the evacuation, from German bombing, from accidents, from cold and disease in the Urals, from malnutrition and overwork. Families were shattered. Communities were destroyed. An entire generation of Soviet workers was traumatized by the experience. The economic cost was also enormous. The evacuation essentially required shutting down Soviet industrial production for 3 to 6 months during the most critical period of the war. In the second half of 1941, Soviet military production dropped by 60% compared to the first half of the year. This contributed directly to Soviet military defeats and the loss of millions of soldiers. There was also permanent loss. Not every factory could be evacuated. In Ukraine alone, over 500 industrial facilities were deliberately destroyed by Soviet forces to prevent their capture by the Germans. The Dnieper hydroelectric station, one of the largest power plants in the world, was blown up. Steel plants were dynamited, mines were flooded. This represented decades of industrial investment destroyed in weeks. The counterfactual question: historians have long debated whether the evacuation was worth its tremendous cost. What if the Soviet Union had instead used those resources to better arm and supply the Red Army in 1941? Could a stronger initial defense have prevented the deep German penetration that made the evacuation necessary? The counterargument is simple mathematics. By 1943, evacuated factories in the Urals and Siberia were producing 70% of Soviet military output. The Urals alone produced 60% of all Soviet tanks, 50% of all artillery pieces, 40% of all ammunition, 65% of all mortars. If those factories had not been evacuated, they would have been captured or destroyed by the Germans in late 1941. The Wehrmacht would have gained access to Soviet industrial capacity, while simultaneously depriving the USSR of its production capability. The Battle of Stalingrad in 1940–43 was won in part because Soviet forces had a continuous supply of tanks, ammunition, and equipment, despite being 2,000 kilometers from the front lines. Those supplies came from evacuated factories. The Kursk Offensive in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, saw Soviet forces deploy 5,000 tanks against 3,000 German tanks. The Soviet numerical advantage came directly from Ural production facilities. By 1944, the Soviet Union was producing more military equipment than Germany, despite having lost huge territories and population centers. This production advantage was the direct result of the 1941 evacuation. The forgotten heroes Alexei Kosygin survived the war and went on to become premier of the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1980. But he rarely spoke publicly about the evacuation, and his role in it remained largely unknown outside specialist circles until decades after his death. The workers who made the evacuation possible, the railway engineers who kept trains moving under bomber attack, the factory workers who operated machinery in open-air winter conditions, the construction crews who built factory buildings in record time, received no special recognition. Many didn't survive the war. Those who did were absorbed back into normal Soviet life, with little acknowledgement of what they had accomplished. Marina Raskova, the metallurgist whose diary entries I quoted earlier, died in January 1943 when her plane crashed during a transfer to a new factory location. She was 30 years old. Her diary survived and was eventually published in the 1960s, providing one of the few personal accounts of the evacuation from a worker's perspective. The cities of the Urals that absorbed the evacuated factories became industrial powerhouses that continued operating throughout the Soviet era and into modern Russia. Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, and Magnitogorsk remain major industrial centers today. But the story of how they were transformed in 1941 is largely forgotten, even in Russia. The legacy of the impossible the Soviet factory evacuation shouldn't have worked. The timeline was impossible. The logistics were overwhelming. The human cost was unconscionable. Yet it succeeded, and in succeeding, it changed the fundamental balance of World War II. It demonstrated something that still resonates today. That industrial capacity is strategic capacity. The nation that can produce weapons will ultimately prevail over the nation with better weapons, but limited production ability. Germany had technological superiority in 1941, but the Soviet Union had industrial depth, and depth proved more important than sophistication. The evacuation also demonstrated the power of systemic thinking under crisis. Kosygin and his team didn't just move factories, they reimagined Soviet industrial geography. They turned a desperate evacuation into an opportunity for structural improvement. The Soviet Union that emerged in the East was industrially stronger than the Soviet Union that had existed in the West. There's a darker lesson here, too, about what societies are capable of when they believe survival is at stake. The Soviet evacuation succeeded in part because individual human costs were considered secondary to collective survival. Workers who refused evacuation were sometimes forcibly relocated. Families were separated. People died from overwork and exposure. The success of the evacuation was built on suffering that would be considered unacceptable in any normal circumstances. But 1941 was not normal circumstances. It was total war, and total war operates by different rules. What it means today, we live in an era where supply chain disruptions cause economic panic. A blocked Suez Canal or a shortage of semiconductor chips triggers global concern. We've built an efficient, interconnected economic system that operates on just-in-time principles with minimal redundancy. The Soviet evacuation reminds us what real supply chain disruption looks like, and what's possible when disruption becomes existential. In 4 months, the Soviet Union relocated its entire industrial base 2,000 kilometers while simultaneously fighting a war for survival. They did this with 1940s technology: no computers, no modern communications, no GPS tracking of freight movements. They succeeded because failure meant annihilation. They had no choice but to make it work, so they made it work. This raises uncomfortable questions about modern resilience. Our systems are optimized for efficiency, not for robustness. We've eliminated redundancy because it's expensive. We've concentrated production because it's economical. We've created global supply chains because they're profitable. But efficient systems are fragile. The Soviet Union in 1940, one had what appeared to be a hopelessly inefficient industrial system spread across vast distances with poor infrastructure. That inefficiency became a strategic advantage when the Western industrial centers fell. The workers of Chelyabinsk, who assembled tanks in open-air factories during -30-degree weather, understood something we may have forgotten: that sometimes survival requires doing things that seem impossible, accepting costs that seem unbearable, and making sacrifices that peacetime economics would never justify. That's not a lesson anyone wants to learn, but it's a lesson worth remembering, because if we ever need it again, we'll need it in a hurry. And unlike the Soviet Union in 1941, we won't have 4 months to figure it out.